Mr. David Myers served during the Vietnam War. He joined the Navy and started his boot camp in Chicago. He trained during the middle of winter. After boot camp, Mr. Myers boarded the USS Seattle in Washington. They left for a cruise that would take them to Da Nang, Vietnam. In Vietnam, he worked in a supply department that distributed out supplies to all the branches. He moved on board the USS Seattle, where he worked as an E-5 in a supply depot. He served for 6 years, 4 active and 2 inactive. When he returned home, he received a Navy Achievement Medal for his service. This medal was given to him by his commander and meant a lot to Mr. Myers because it shows how highly he was thought of and thanks him for his service. Mr. David Myers was born on October 25, 1974. He is the father of 2 children, David Myers and Elizabeth Strickler. He is married and lives in Myerstown, PA. He had 1 brother who had passed and both his parents are deceased. His father was also in the Army and joined the military during World War II and was part of D-Day. He grew up in the Lebanon area and has lived there all of his life before he left for the service. Mr. Myers met his wife before he left for his military service. They met at a Youth for Christ softball game, where he accidentally hit her with a foul ball. He works in a machine shop but left after a year to join the service. Mr. Myers enlisted in the Navy when he was 20 years old. He decided it would be better to pick his new career than to be put into one. He never thought he would end up in the Navy and only joined because of Vietnam. He started his boot camp training in Great Lakes, Chicago on February 23, 1967. He left by train from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to Chicago, where they were having a blizzard. The recruit's first task was to shovel parking lots, which had about 18 inches of snow on them. Mr. Myers explained his boot camp service by saying,
Basically, boot camp was to teach you to follow rules and regulations.
He found the switch to military lifestyle pretty easy. His parents ran a strict home, so the change came to him. After boot camp, Mr. Myers left for Newport, Rhode Island, where his Navy training continued.
After boot camp and then at Vietnam for a year and a half, Mr. Myers spent most of his time aboard the USS Seattle. The USS Seattle was 18 feet long, 107 feet wide, and there are 24 officers, 576 enlisted, and powered by steam turbines. The USS Seattle was a supply ship, and it supplied both fuel for the ships and supplied the ammunition for the ships.
The USS Seattle was a supply ship, and it supplied both the fuel for the ships, it supplied ammunition for the ships, and then we had repair parts that the ships would need, as well as general stores. So it was back in those days, I guess you'd compare it to a floating Walmart. Right now, I mean, you had just about everything that you needed to supply all the other ships with on there.
A typical day on the ship would start with one waking up at 5:30, and then he would go to breakfast in the mess hall. Then after that, one would go down into the supply department office by 7 in the morning, and then on a normal day, he'd be done by around 5. One of Mr. Myers' neatest moments was when they were in the Mediterranean during the Jordanian crisis. There was a ship that was dead in the water and needed a repair part. He said the chief department didn't want to do it, so they made him do it. He described this unusual moment like this. I flew my helicopter from our supply ship, which we had 2 helicopters on board. I flew my helicopter over the aircraft, and at the aircraft carrier I got on board a fighter jet. As we catapulted off the aircraft carrier to go to Rhodes, Spain, to get a repair part, and it was just like an O-ring, but that's all we needed to get the ship going. So I had the opportunity to get catapulted off the aircraft carrier and land back on the aircraft carrier and get the part back to the ship to be able to get the other ship operating. Mr. Myers was in medical supply in Vietnam. There they kept serums and things like that for the hospital and ships. One day the supply depot came under a mortar attack, and some other men and him went back to the supply depot to see what they could of the vaccines and serums. There he saw a live mortar in the reefer. Fortunately, it didn't go off. Mr. Myers described the mortar by saying, "A mortar is a shell that is projected out of a small tube. and they can direct their fire by the angle of the tube, and know how far it is going to go, and what they do is basically drop the shell into the mortar. It's a pin in the bottom, and it shoots a projectile out, and then when it lands, it's supposed to explode, if it is a good shell. But that one happened to not explode. This was his closest near-death experience. Mr. Myers was never involved in combat. The most he ever had was a .45 pistol strapped to one, if one had to be anywhere. While Mr. Myers was spending time in the medical supply for about a month, he occasionally witnessed casualties from men that were severely hurt. He described his emotions at this by saying, "The emotions probably ran both ways, of being proud, but also knowing how lucky you were that you weren't one of those being carried off a helicopter." Mr. Myers worked with a variety of different ranks. The chief was an E7, and the chief was in charge of what they did, and there was a lieutenant commander that was over him. E7 was not the highest rank. Once you get into the officer ranking, they don't go by ranking. Like an E1 is boot camp, and E2 is when you graduate from boot camp, and you keep working your way up. The highest is as an E9, which is the Master Chief. After the sailor could get to be a warrant officer. You earned your ranks by progressing in short terms. An E2 was earned after graduating from boot camp. Once a sailor got to try to be an E4, the sailor had to have a certain amount of time that he served, and then had to take an exam. Mr. Myers was an E5. He was going to be an E6, so he took the test because he had time. When he passed it, though, he would have had to extend his enlistment in the service to be able to accept that rank. He was getting his honorary discharge sooner than that, so he couldn't accept the higher rank. He also earned medals during his service. He got a medal for being in Vietnam. He also got a medal called Navy Achievement Medal. He treasures that medal because none of his other friends received that medal, so he felt appreciated that his officer thought that highly of him. Mr. Myers often kept in touch with his family. No matter where he was located, he could always write letters. The mail was delivered through FPO, Fleet Post Office, and then the mail made its way to the ship. The mail came by helicopter. The mail would get sorted and delivered to the different ships. Mr. Myers would play a game of basketball with his group of friends. He said that they were a close-knit group. You're on board a ship. You don't have no place to go. You can't decide you're going to take off and go to the city for the day. Is how Mr. Myers put it. With his little free time, he usually spent it either playing basketball, pinochle, or in the weight room. He often stood shore patrol, where they were in port. He said that he often did it for other people who didn't want to do it. That way he made money. Whenever one had shore patrol, one actually went in and checked in with the police department. He could ride along with the officers and go into the bars and restaurants where the servicemen stayed to make sure that there were no problems. They always gave him the first opportunity. If the sailor was having trouble behaving themselves, to take the sailor back to the ship. And he got paid for all this, so he said that it was a neat experience. When he was over in the Mediterranean, they went over to Spain, and from Spain they flew back to Philadelphia by an Air Force plane. Then he was discharged at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Philly. His wife's brother had a business, and because he was in supply, they hired him. And he started working at the Mutual Wholesale. The supply department activities helped him tremendously to be able to work with that business. Some life lessons that Mr. Myers learned from his service include, you treat people that you're dealing with like how you want to be treated. It made things work very well, and there were often times when men were playing cards or something. Then a call would come in, and he would go take care of it. Those men would notice it, and in the future they would return the favor for Mr. Myers. Some of his memorable things that he remembered was just getting to go to a lot of places he wouldn't have gotten to go otherwise. He was in Hawaii, Birmingham, Washington, California, Panama Canal, New Orleans, Florida, Norfolk, and then a cruise to Spain, then Italy, and then Greece. Just a lot of cool places that you see once in a lifetime. Thank you for your service, Mr. Myers.